Welcome to the Hardy Woods Podcast. I'm your host, Colin Fraser. Sometimes it seems though forests are places where time stands still. If we just leave well enough alone, everything will stay in perfect harmony. That's not always the case. Oak trees are declining across the eastern U.S., and today's episode is about why that's happening, why it matters, and what can be done about it. Oak decline is not a simple thing, and neither are the possible remedies, but fortunately we have an incredibly impressive guest today to help us understand all this, Dr. Daniel Day. Dr. Day has a very impressive resume. He's an assistant director of research for the USDA Forest Service, the Northern Research Station. He's been a research forester since 1987, with research emphasis on ecology, silviculture, eastern forests, woodlands, and savannas. He received his PhD in 1991 from the University of Missouri, and since then has worked as a research forester for the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources, the Missouri Department of Conservation, and the USDA Forest Service. Before becoming a scientist, Dr. Day worked as a forester at Ketchikan Ranger District, Tongass National Forest, the Red River Ranger District, as well as the Nez Perce National Forest. Dr. Day, thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Colin. Glad to be here.
So, as we mentioned there in the intro, oaks are in decline across the east, and I've looked at some materials from the Forest Service, and it looks like in some places around 72% of areas of mature oak forests are lacking oak saplings, meaning that the young forests are not getting regenerated. So I guess the big question to start with is, how did we get here?
Yeah, it is kind of a perplexing situation when you consider that different oak forest types, mainly uplands, but also bottomland oak forests, are they comprise a little bit over half of the eastern forest in the U.S. And so you think something that's so widespread and abundant and dominant in many places, how could it be having a problem? But it is. And how we got here is deeply rooted back in time, and going back to the beginning of plants showing up on land. And some people estimate that might have been about 400 million years ago. When plants developed, then the fire triangle was complete. There's three legs to the fire triangle: fuels, oxygen, and a heat source like lightning or volcanoes. And so fire has been on the earth as long as plants have, and that's been for a long time. And then from some studies of fossil records in North America, people estimate that oaks became present in North America about 50 million years ago, and that they were widespread and abundant for the past 23 million years. So that predates what we know of when humans were in North America, which might be anywhere from 15 to maybe 20,000 years ago is the best guess, I think, at this time. And so before humans, fire was common. It was ignited primarily by lightning, but also volcanoes, and then maybe some other, incidental forms of ignition. And of course, it was influenced by the climate, the vegetation, the fuels, and topography. And it pretty much ran and spread if the weather and fuels permitted. And it might die down, and then it might flare up again in a dry period and take off again. So it kind of did its own thing, unchecked.
So what's that relationship, though, for people that don't know, between oaks and fire? Because I think maybe we're used to thinking about them in tandem, but some people might not think about it that way.
Yeah. Well, worldwide, there's some 600 species of oak in the northern hemisphere. And many of those species have common traits that we consider to be adaptations to fire. Things like the ability to sprout readily after the top of the tree is killed by fire or by drought or by a herbivore. And as they grow up in between fires, their bark thickens as it does on any tree. And for many of the oak species, their bark thickens at a faster rate than other tree species. And for given diameters, their bark may be thicker than many other tree species. And the importance of bark thickness is that it protects the cambium, the living cambium underneath the bark of the tree, from being killed by high temperatures of fire. So they have some mechanisms like bark thickness and bark growth rates that help them to persist in more frequent fire regimes. And there's other adaptations. Some of the oak species actually have leaf litter that is more flammable than other hardwood species, or the nature of oak leaves, how they curl up when they dry on the forest floor. They create a very complex, well aerated litter bed that promotes the start of a fire and the spread of fire through leaf litter. And
so they're tolerant to survive fire, and they're adapted to facilitate fire.
Right.
I guess.
Yeah.
Right.
And so the oaks and the pines, are in, I mean, there's a lot of different oak and pine species, and they're not all the same, but many of them are well adapted to fire. And in the pines are similar to what I just mentioned with the oaks in terms of having highly flammable needle litter, and that just promotes fire occurrence and spread in areas where pines are dominant in the overstory. And so those two genera, the Quercus and the Pinus species, are generally well adapted to fire. And so that's why I put so much emphasis on the history of fire. When we look at long-term studies over the past 10,000 years or more, using the pollen and charcoal sediments in certain types of lakes and peat bogs, we always see high levels of oak pollen during periods where there is high amounts of charcoal in the sediment profile, and that's related to the occurrence, the frequency, the magnitude of fires on larger landscapes. And we do know from tree ring dendrochronology studies that identify fire scars in the tree rings of old stumps or snags or old living trees. We can determine if a fire occurred in the forest by the scar it leaves on a surviving tree, and we can use the tree rings to date those scars. And that gives us annual or even less than annual resolution of documenting the history of fire. And we've been able to go back to the 1400s, I think, is one of the earliest fire scar trees on record, early 1400s. But we have pretty good fire histories throughout the eastern U.S. in oak and pine ecosystems that cover the past 400 years. And so that kind of covers the period of time. It was the near the end of the Native American period. Even back then, they were affected by European diseases brought over by the early explorers and fur trappers. So things, even in that time frame, were still somewhat under the influence of European immigration. But well before settlement and then European land use changes. And so we kind of have a record of fire at the end of the Native American period, at the beginning of the early European settler period, and up to modern times. And this is a generalization, but it's a pretty consistent observation when you look at fire histories throughout the eastern U.S. and actually in many places around the world. When you have an aboriginal native culture that's hunter-gatherer subsistence, and they used fire frequently to manage the land for the things that they valued and needed, and then they started developing agriculture, maybe 3 or 4 thousand years ago, and that allowed them to be more sedentary in their villages, and but still very much using fire to manage the landscapes around them to supplement their agricultural production. And then when the early European settlers started moving in, we can't forget that they came from Europe. They were Aboriginal in different European places, countries, and they had their own fire history and fire culture that they brought with them. But they also learned from the Native Americans and the use of fire in this new environment, this new world. And it wasn't much of a transition for them to shift their fire history and fire culture to the new world, taking a cue from Native American uses of fire. And so we actually see the frequency of fire increase initially when Europeans start moving into different areas, and more frequent than what Native Americans were doing. And then at some point, the fire, the land became more settled. There was more development. There was more infrastructure. There were more things at risk from wildfires, and so people started viewing fire negatively and as a threat. And we started as a society developing laws and policies and programs to control wildfires. And there were some really big wildfires in the east that burned millions of acres and killed lots of people, especially when the fires were burning through the widespread logging slash at the end of the 18th or 19th century and beginning of the 20th centuries. And then we really started suppressing fires, and we continue to do that to this day. And we do a pretty good job of it, but we never can eliminate fire because there's always the fuel and the availability of that fuel to burn in times of drought or in dry periods, seasons of the year. And there's always the lightning ignited fires, but most fires today are still ignited by humans. I think a lot of state fire departments that keep records on that, I think they report commonly that human arson is the cause of over 90% or maybe 99% of the fires that occur today. And so it's, fire is always there, and it's only because we suppress it that we've been able to pretty successfully remove it as a natural component of these oak and pine ecosystems, prairie ecosystems, ecosystems that we call savannas and woodlands, that are more open forest types, where oaks and pines were dominant tree species in those more open systems because of their adaptations to fire. And so prior to this modern period of fire suppression, we had an anthropogenic, a human-driven fire regime that was bounded by climate and topography and soils and existing vegetation. And what that created was a real mosaic, a real diversity of different types of, I'll call them natural communities: prairies, savannas, woodlands, and forest. And so, for example, there's a real strong interaction between fire and land and topography and landform. So where you have flat plains, fire can spread and spread widely over large areas. And so individual fire ignitions can burn lots of acres, and you have relatively high fire frequencies in those areas of flat topography. And that's where we had a lot of our prairies, and on the edges of the prairies were oak savannas, and then that transitioned into woodlands and even into mesic forest, where we have more topography. You have less fire frequency and smaller fires. And so there's different niches on the landscape for mesic cove type forests to exist, but also open pine and oak savannas and woodlands. And so it was a real diverse landscape historically, and it's just the opposite today. We either have agriculture, urban areas, or we have closed canopy mature forests. And so there's a lot less diversity across the landscape. And that feeds some current problems and issues that we have today as landowners and forest managers, in that a low diversity landscape like that has low resilience to drought, insect outbreaks, disease outbreaks, or wildfires. And so when those things happen, and they were all part of the natural process in the past, but when the landscape is homogeneous, they can spread and cover a lot more ground than they did in the past. In the past, the diversity of natural communities and vegetation would act as barriers to the spread of insects or disease or even fire. And so we realize now that the past 100 years of fire suppression has created a lot of ecological and social problems that we're trying to learn how to undo.
That's the question I was going to ask you, is when did the regime change on fire suppression? I was thinking around the early 20th century, right? Smokey the Bear came on the scene around then.
I think the Smokey Bear mascot was born in, I think, 1944 or something like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So he's not quite that old, but I guess fire suppression started around 1900.
Yeah, and so just prior to the fire suppression era, we had frequent fires, we had grazing herbivores, bison, elk, deer, throughout much of the East. Mm-hmm. Europeans show up, they start cutting a little bit of timber. I mean, there's all these, it's not just fire, there's all these disturbances going on in concert with each other. But fire was really influential in the trajectory of where the plant community that would go in the state it was currently in. And so when the oaks and pines are adapted to regenerating and to resisting and surviving and persisting in these types of fire regimes. And so when you stop the fire, they're in a very competitive position to become dominant. And where there were younger forest, or where there was more open forest, it very quickly, trees regenerated, and many of those trees were oaks and pines, and they became the mature forest that we've been, witnessing in our lifetimes. And
right,
yeah.
So when the social tolerance for those regular fires went away, and we started this fire suppression, obviously we changed the plant communities, we changed the animal communities. I find it fascinating when you look at the big animals leaving the East. I think the last elk died in Virginia in 1865.
Yeah. And that was part of the equation too, in promoting oaks anyways, is, elk and deer are browsers. We had the passenger pigeon. There were lots of them, billions of them. Mm-hmm. They ate acorns. And there's wild turkey. large populations of them. They eat acorns, and part of the European consequence was subsistence hunting, but on a much bigger scale than Native Americans ever did, and then market hunting.
Mm-hmm.
And so they eliminated the passenger pigeon, the wild turkey, the white-tailed deer. I remember as a kid, I lived in Wisconsin. There was such low deer populations in the state. We had limited or no deer hunting in certain areas of the state. Very controlled and limited deer hunting. Now, in the course of my life, there are too many deer.
It's hard. It's hard to get to work. I heard a guy from here in Virginia say you'd go home and tell your mom if you saw a deer track.
Yeah.
When he was a kid, and now, I mean, it's you're steering around them.
Yeah,
and
where we have way too high a deer populations in many places in the east, and where you have that, you have oak regeneration problems on top of other things we're going to talk about here. So that was all part of this historical shift from oak and pine dominance to probably I don't know if I'm going out on a limb to say this, but I want to say as a result of early European settlement, we probably had more oak forest and more dominant oak forest on more of the landscape than we maybe ever had in the past, even on more mesic and productive sites.
That's fascinating.
Where today we're having the most problems in regenerating oak, and there's oak in the overstory, and so people are going, "What's the deal?" And the understanding of what's going on is deeply rooted in this history, at least over the last 100 years, to help explain our modern day forest and how they are shifting away from oak and pines to other species.
And that's kind of the next thing I wanted to talk about is that shift. The term mesification comes up all the time. I think that needs a little bit of definition, but what is that shift? Like, what's happening if it's not the old landscape, if it's not the old plant community? What's coming in now?
Well, a lot of what's replacing the oak are what we call more mesic species, which mean they might be more moisture demanding, or they might have an advantage on more moist sites or more productive sites, or sites that are more protected from sun exposure and the elements, like north slopes, northeast slopes, are more protected than south and west slopes. They get less sun exposure. They're cooler. They're more moist. They have, more mesic microclimates. And so the species that are favored in those environments under certain disturbances are gaining in abundance and dominance as the forest changes. And so, for example, you have a lot of maple species, beech, and other shade-tolerant species that can hang out in the low light of the understory and persist and slowly grow. And when there's a small canopy opening from a single tree dying or a small group of trees dying, they're already well established, and they're able to take advantage of that increase in sunlight to fill that gap and grow into the overstory. And so in our oak forest, what we've seen through this process of mesification is understories dominated by these shade-tolerant species developing more dense understories, developing a mid-story canopy, which maybe was never there before, and the trees are growing up into the overstory. And these different layers, these different canopy layers, the understory, the mid-story, the overstory, they all are different layers of leaves, of vegetation that filter and absorb sunlight. So when you get down to the forest floor, there may be almost less than 5%, maybe 1% of full sunlight at the forest floor. And that's not enough light for oaks, any oak species, to survive. And so what you commonly see is you have a good acorn. If you have oaks in the overstory, you have a good acorn crop. Those acorns have enough energy in them to allow the seedling to develop the first year. So you'll get these 6-inch tall seedlings. And then the energy from the acorn is gone, and there's not enough light for the oak to make its own through photosynthesis in the leaves. And so, after a good acorn crop, there's studies that show for northern red oak, after 10 years, there's almost no oak seedlings in the understory from that acorn crop 10 years ago. So they just don't persist in that low light in our modern day forest. And there's some other things related to this concept of mesification, and that is that these species like maples and beech have leaves that are relatively flat. When they fall on the ground, it makes a very compact, flat, dense leaf litter, and they decompose pretty quickly. So several things are going on here. One is they retain and hold a lot of moisture in the ground level, and so that does not favor fire spreading in the understory through the leaf litter. They decompose quickly, so the leaf litter, the amount of fuel in the litter is less under maple and beech forest canopies, and they create a more moist environment. So there's higher fuel moisture content, which doesn't promote, ignition and spread of fire. And so part of the concept is that they actually, like we talked earlier about the oaks and pine having flammable needles and leaves, and by the arrangement and the nature of the leaves curling up and creating aerated fuel beds, and promoting fire, these mesophytic species like maples and beech do just the opposite. They have compact, dense leaf litter. They retard the ability of fire to ignite and spread through those forests, and so they actually, are naturally suppressing fire to some extent.
Right. So those mesic species create an environment in which they propagate themselves rather than the xeric, meaning dry, litter creating oak. So it kind of like, it just begets more. It becomes its own cycle.
Correct.
I guess.
Yeah.
I was really surprised to see that when I'd spent a lot of time in the woods before I ever worked in the woods in forestry. And I was amazed by how much I hadn't noticed of that kind of thing about species composition and about how the species present were creating an environment in which certain species would regenerate.
Right.
And I think there are a lot of people that really love the woods that maybe don't see that. And I'm hoping that this kind of, this idea of mesification can become a little bit more mainstream.
Yeah.
Because it really is a big deal.
Yeah. And I don't know. It really adds to the enjoyment of your walk through the woods, whether you're hunting or berry picking or bird watching, to understand, to know the species that are there and to understand how they live and how they interact with each other and how they change the environment, for their betterment or not. The downside to that is you become maybe more aware of problems, and I don't want you worrying about these problems while you're out trying to enjoy nature.
Not everything has to feel like work, right?
Right.
But getting to it being a big deal, what are the implications of this shift? Like ecologically, we talked about passenger pigeons and big animals that are gone now. But then there are also economic issues that have come up with the loss of this resource, right?
Right. So, I mean, every species, and in this case, we're focusing on trees, has value, you know, and and but in terms of economics or ecological um, goods and services, values, aesthetics, things that people derive from the forest, oaks are really, at the top of the list in terms of value. Economically, you know, oak for fine furniture, flooring, veneer, stave bolts for making barrels for whiskey and wine and other spirits. It's just really a diverse wood and a high quality wood and a highly valued wood. And so it's been the basis for a lot of our consumer goods that we enjoy, that we build our homes with, that we value, and the jobs in the logging industry and the manufacturing industries that are based on healthy, good, productive oak forest. And so to lose those has real economic impacts. And there's not a lot of other trees that can take the place of oak in some of our forest products and things that we value, as a oak as a commodity. But oak as a member of the ecosystem contributes greatly in many ways to the health and productivity of the ecosystems. The acorns are high in energy, and there's many, many hundreds of species of wildlife, insects, mammals, birds that feed on acorns. It's a large part of their diet, or at least in the season of acorn fall, which is like right before the winter. You're getting this high energy nut crop, and it's really important for a lot of species and whether they're going to survive the winter or not and have a healthy, reproduction in the spring and healthy, offspring. And so it's really important that way. From the nut crop, the trees, especially in the white oak group, are even as they're long lived, 200, 400-year old. Post oaks or white oaks, Quercus alba, are not uncommon in more old growth areas. And so when you have a den cavity tree form, it's able to perform that habitat role in the ecosystem for a lot longer time than other trees that rot more quickly and fall down. And then there's been studies that show that the diversity and abundance of insects in the canopy of a forest dominated by oaks is much greater than a forest that it has no oaks in it. And the same goes for diversity and abundance of insects and soil microbes in oak leaf litter. The abundance and diversity is much greater than it would be under a sugar maple or red maple or a American beech forest. So there's just
bats are one of those things too,
right?
That are almost obligate to white oaks,
right? And then there's just a whole host of plant and animal wildlife species that really prefer more open oak forest, which we also call savannas and woodlands. And they don't prosper in the deep, dark, dense forest condition. And we've got a lot of that on the landscape right now. One of the biggest wildlife conservation issues right now is the lack of open forest systems and grasslands, prairies. And there's maybe, well, I've seen estimates of less than 1% of the original prairies before European settlement exist today. And I don't know that anybody has a defensible estimate of how many oak woodlands have been lost, but I think a lot have, because when you look at the fire frequency in the past 400 years, that frequency in many places in the eastern U.S., which ranges from 10 to 15 years, or 1 to 2 years to maybe 15 years on average, that's frequent enough fire to create open oak woodlands. And when you stop that fire, the trees fill in very quickly and they become dense forests. That's what we have today. And so when there's a study by Rich Guyette and others published in 2012, and it presents a continental U.S. estimate of fire frequency before European settlement, and that's a really visually phenomenal, portrayal of the role of fire and the frequency of fire over much of our country, but especially in the eastern U.S. And when you just look at those fire frequencies, you have to conclude circumstantially, if nothing else, there must have been a lot of open oak woodlands. And so when you consider half of the forest in the east are oak types, maybe a significant amount of those were open woodlands in the past. And so all in woodlands and savannas are the most biodiverse plant species, natural communities there are. More diverse in prairies, more diverse in woodlands, and certainly way more diverse than closed canopy complex forest. And if you have, since plants are at the base of habitat and food chains, if you have greater diversity in your plant community, you have greater insect diversity, greater diversity in seed production and seed availability throughout the year. That leads to greater diversity throughout the rest of the ecosystem and the food web. And so with the loss of those, it's no surprise that we have a lot of plant and animal species that are of conservation concern. And these, big declines in songbird populations and other populations, a lot of that is related to the loss of habitat. There's other factors, but like fundamental to population declines is they have no place to live. And it's interesting. I used to work with a songbird biologist. He sat right next to me in the office next door, and I learned a lot from him. And one of the things he said was, even birds that require interior forest, closed canopy forest, dense forest, complex forest, and they need those habitats on the landscape to complete their life cycle. But part of their life cycle, after the young fledge from the nest, where they go on the landscape is to more open habitats, because that's where the hiding cover is, that's where the food is, whether they're an insect or a seed feeder. That's where the banquet is in those more open forests. And they spend their time there growing up and preparing for migration if they're a migratory species. So they're utilizing the energy in those systems. And we're just missing that on our landscapes. So, I guess one final thought on that is, some people have studied, if you clear cut a forest, that creates an early seral stage in forest succession, early open successional habitat. And some of these open habitat demanding species do benefit from that. But the problem with that versus an open habitat maintained by frequent fire is that the woody vegetation grows up very quickly. And so it's good habitat for a short period of time, and then it's lost. And so we need these more open savannas and woodlands that require fire to be maintained in the east. Otherwise, they go to dense forest. And I guess I'll just probably end the, one final thought on why is the loss of oak forest important? A lot of people say, Dan, you're talking about the past fire history, the past landscape, and things are different now, and things are going to be really different in the future. And that's all true. So you got to live in the future, Dan, get out of the past. But the situation we're in right now is really a unique situation in that the past is really a guide to the solution for the future. And I mentioned earlier that these more diverse landscapes of prairie, savanna, woodland, forest are higher in resilience. They can withstand insect, disease outbreak, droughts, wildfires without losing the entire landscape, like you see when there's an oak decline event in a region, or a southern pine beetle outbreak, or a mountain pine beetle outbreak out west, or the huge 800,000 acre wildfires out west. And those are not resilient landscapes. Those are highly vulnerable landscapes. And so the past condition of higher diversity on the landscape guides what we should be managing for in the future. And it just so happens that these more open forests that had oak and pine in the overstory, those conditions and those species are better adapted to future climates than the mesophytic species, because we expect in the future for temperatures to rise, for there to be more extreme weather events, more extreme drought, maybe more frequent drought. The mesophytes are not well adapted to that. And so the historic dominant species, the oaks and the pines, are actually well poised to resist and be resilient to future, climate scenarios or uncertain outbreaks in insect disease or increased drought or increased wildfire. As we said, they're all have a lot of adaptations to fire. So with increased temperatures, increased drought, you can expect an increase in wildfires.
Well, I mean, on that note of looking to the future in terms of dealing with the shifted landscape that we've got now, where do harvest patterns fit into this? Like in terms of contributing to or improving the oak decline situation?
Yeah, if you are on, in many places, if you're on an average or higher site productivity, and where competing vegetation, because the site is more fertile, it's got moisture, there's just more resources for plants to grow and to grow well, you have much more competition. And on those sites, if all you do is go in and clear cut, or cut single trees, or cut small groups of trees, or don't cut at all, it's going to shift away from an oak composition. And actually the cutting itself accelerates that transition. So if you're doing small scale harvesting, single trees, small groups of trees, or you're trying to preserve the oak forest by not doing anything, you still get single tree gaps from natural mortality of the overstory. In that kind of disturbance regime, you're going to get a dominance of the shade tolerant species that are coming up through the understory and the midstory. And where you do a more intensive harvest, we might call it clear cut, or the shelterwood method of regeneration. If you have these larger openings in the forest, what you may see is the shade intolerant species like birches or yellow poplar or aspen, species that thrive in the full sunlight and can grow really fast. They can form a closed canopy very quickly and shade out any oak seedlings there are around. And so the method of cutting can change the composition shift from, if it's small scale, small gap cutting, it's going to be the shade tolerant species. And if it's bigger cuts, it's going to be the intolerant fast growing species, the pioneer species. It won't be oak. And that's why it's important to consider that regenerating oak is a process. It's not an event. It's not the timber harvest. That's only the way we control overstory density and create environmental conditions in the regeneration layer to favor the species we want. So we modify how we cut to favor the species we want. But there's a lot of other silviculture that goes on with the commercial timber harvest, either before, during, and usually after, to adapt with the vegetation response and to steer it and guide it toward a desired condition that we want, whether it's for carbon sequestration, oak regeneration, wildlife habitat, aesthetics. I mean, usually there's many, many management objectives that are going on all at once when we plan how to manage the forest. But if all you do is a commercial harvest, or you don't harvest at all, you're pretty much going to lose the oak forest that you have today, especially on the more productive sites.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Is that one of those places where the idea of advanced regeneration, advanced reproduction comes in? Like,
right, when you
preparation?
Yeah, when you're thinking about regenerating a forest, it's really important to think about the different ways trees regenerate. And of course, the first is they regenerate from seed and through sexual reproduction. And all species in the East produce seed. But then there's also an asexual method of reproduction. We call it vegetative reproduction or sprouting. And so species vary in their ability to vegetatively sprout. And the oaks are really good at it when they're small diameter and young. Even as seedlings, they have a high ability to sprout if they lose their top to drought or fire or grazing or just mechanical cutting. But a lot of other species can sprout prolifically too, like red maple, and so you just have to consider the set of species that you have in your forest, consider how they regenerate. And even though all species can regenerate by asexual or sexual methods, usually there's a predominant way a species may regenerate. And for oaks, that's vegetatively, and that's by a source we call advanced reproduction. So when an oak seedling is established in the understory of a forest, which is a common situation in our forest, as I said before, it develops from the energy of the acorn, and then if there's enough sunlight, it can start making its own food through photosynthesis. And if the top is killed, but not the root system, there's a cluster of buds at what we call the root collar, where the stem meets the root system. We call that the root collar, and there's a cluster of buds there. And with the loss of the top, those buds are able to start growing and make a new top. And so if there's sufficient light for that oak reproduction to survive and grow, it just gets bigger and bigger. It may go through many cycles of the top dies back, it resprouts, it grows bigger. The top dies back, it resprouts, it grows bigger if there's enough light. Then, if there's a major removal of the overstory, you have these oak sprouts with big root systems, and they can grow fast in that condition. They don't grow fast from an acorn in terms of shoot growth. They have an evolved strategy of investing in root growth from the day they're born. And that's a good strategy where you have frequent disturbances like fire or grazing herds or periodic drought. But it's not a good strategy where you don't have those disturbances, you have low light, or you're on a productive site and there's other species that can grow really fast above ground and shade you out.
Can removing the mid-story create that open structure and allow that light in?
Right.
To allow regeneration?
Yeah, it can. And that's often a first place to start in the process of promoting oak regeneration, is to try to give it more light than less than 5%. And I'm generalizing here, but in a hardwood forest, if you take out the mid-story, you're going to go from 1% of full sunlight up to about 10 to 15% of full sunlight. So that's an improvement. Can oak do better with more light? Yes. But you're moving in the right direction. And one reason why you may not want to open it up all at once is because you're using the shade of the overstory to hold back some of the competing species. Because the increased light is also favorable to all the other species and ground flora that are, on site.
That makes sense.
And so you may want to ease your way into increasing the amount of light while you're doing other forestry practices to control the competing vegetation that's also enjoying the increased light.
And that gets back to what you were saying about oak regeneration as being part of a larger process.
Right.
Rather than like a 1-year project.
Right. And there's lots of ways, to get from A to B. Like if you're driving in your car from Columbia, Missouri to wherever you live, there's a lot of different road routes you could take to get there. And there's generally a number of ways you can try to improve the current mature forest condition to promote oak. One thing you can do is if there's not a lot of oak in the overstory, in the understory right now, you can do things to try to reduce the woody competing vegetation in the understory before the next good acorn crop. And so you can use cutting and herbicides, you can use prescribed fire, you can use combinations of those to reduce the understory woodies species and the mid-story, as you mentioned. And you can be doing kind of a site preparation in managing the competing vegetation that way. Then when you get a good acorn crop, you may not want to burn because acorns are highly susceptible to being killed by a surface fire. And but if the seedlings are a couple of 2 or 3 years old, they're much better able to. They got a big enough root system by then. If they have this increased light from a mid-story removal, they've been able to survive and build some root system so that if you then burn and top kill them, they have enough energy in the roots to produce sprout growth. And if that if that fire continues to open up the stand, or you do it in conjunction with a commercial timber harvest or commercial thinning, to increase the light even more, you can. That's a good combination of harvesting or commercial thinning with prescribed burning, and you're harvesting to increase light, you're burning to control the competing vegetation, and as long as you're not burning too often, then the oaks have enough time in between your fires, and that may only be 3 or 5 years,
Mm-hmm.
So if you give them 3 years or more of adequate light, they can survive for decades like that in a cycle of burning every 3 or 5 years. And all the time, they're building a bigger and bigger and bigger root system.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why a common recommendation to promote oak is to use the shelter wood method and treat the mid-story, use a shelter wood method, and prescribe burning in some combination depending on your stand conditions, and to promote oak and control the other vegetation.
Well, that answers a couple of questions that I was gonna ask you as we round in on an hour here. I was going to ask you what the best advice for landowners is, but I think that you kind of answered it there, which is that it's going to be a variety of steps. It's going to depend on where you're starting, and to manage it holistically with an eye toward the site and toward woody competition. And then I think that's fantastic.
Yeah.
But I did want to ask you, like, as I know this has been like a big part of what you've studied, and it's a lot of what I think about too in terms of oak decline and recovery as more from a commercial perspective sometimes. But what's your prognostication on oak recovery in the East? I know that there are groups that are working on it, like the White Oak Initiative is bringing people together, and we talked to those people as well. But what are your thoughts on the coming, I guess, decades of this problem and solution?
Yeah. Well, number one, I'm an optimist, so I always think we can do this. It is a huge problem. It's a huge landscape problem. We're talking about the whole range of oak in the eastern U.S. Managing oak regeneration on 20 acres is not going to solve the problem for economics or wildlife or landscape resilience and adaptability to future climates. And we're talking about a landscape that's primarily owned by private individuals.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's going to take federal, state agencies, in non-government conservation organizations, private landowner groups, prescribed burn councils, associations. It's going to take all of us working together with some common consensus of what needs to be done. So a big part of gaining that consensus is through science delivery, like the Joint Fire Science exchanges that cover the eastern U.S. They disseminate information. Every agency has, a communications or science delivery group. The White Oak Initiative does a lot of, science delivery, extension work, public awareness. So the first thing we have to do is educate and make people aware, and give them good reasons why they should even care or make these kinds of investments. And it is an investment. Currently a lot of the things I've been talking about, treat the understory, treat the mid-story, do a prescribed burn. These things cost money. There's no profit in it immediately for the landowner. And so the economics is a big challenge to implementing good oak silviculture. And And so, I mean, that we got to work on that. And there are people working on that. We have a forest products lab up in Madison, Wisconsin, and other people are looking at biofuels, biomass, biochar production, the use of currently unmerchantable material in a merchantable, you know, forest product market way. So we need
Right, and that gets back to putting a market incentive on those mid-story trees, right?
right, you know, um, industry is not evil. Making a profit is not evil. These things are what allow us to do all the other conservation work that we need to do for the multitude of reasons of conservation of native biodiversity, control of invasive species, improving wildlife habitat, recovery of threatened and endangered species, um, more resilient ecosystems and landscapes. All these things that we value and we strive to manage for require the management to be affordable, and also we benefit from the goods and services that come out of the forest products industry. And we need innovative products, we need new markets, and to help fund our restoration and our conservation work. So there's a lot of challenges there. It's a big problem. It's complex ownership. There's huge social constraints on forest practices, maybe,
Mm-hmm.
for or against herbicides, prescribed fire, cutting timber. These are all controversial topics in different places. And so that there's a lot of social science that needs to be brought to bear to help solve these barriers to good conservation. We don't know everything, not even close. And it's always the devil in the details, but we do know a lot about what we need to be doing, even in general. That's an improvement over what's happening now in oak management. And so we're less limited by our ecological and silvicultural forestry knowledge on what needs to happen than we are by economic or social constraints and ownership
Mm-hmm.
complications. And so these are all variables in the equation of successful oak regeneration and sustaining oak forest and woodlands and savannas. And it's going to take all of us to solve that.
Yeah, well, talking to you today, I'm inclined to be optimistic too. I mean, we've got, as you said, we've got some like practical scientific questions to keep answering and smart people doing the work there, and maybe some technological and economic questions on how to incentivize better forestry practice. The cultural shifts are hopefully something that we're doing right now, getting more people to understand these things that care about them. But
Well,
it's definitely doable.
When you say cultural, you just made me think of this too. In the past, we lived off the land. You were outside hacking brush, grazing, areas and burning stuff and disturbing the earth. And oaks are actually pretty comfortable in a situation like that. Now we never leave our houses. We have our computers, internet, smartphones. I walk around my
Mm-hmm.
neighborhood. I live in a suburban, neighborhood, and I walk around and I'm the only person outside. We aren't out there, disturbing the forest. And so it is kind of a cultural shift, or a new way of looking at land stewardship, land management, as a society that lives indoors mostly.
Right, right. I mean, here we are sitting, looking at a computer screen, talking about it, right?
Right. And I know a lot of state conservation agencies and whatnot. They have a lot of programs to try to get people and get kids out there hunting and fishing or bird watching or catching butterflies, and enjoying nature. And we're realizing all the health values of being in nature forest bathing, for your health. And it's a lot of things suffer when people don't go outdoors, including the people themselves.
And the lack of understanding that comes with that.
Right.
We can always learn more.
We just get totally disconnected, and it's not good to be disconnected, because then it's easy. We don't even know when we're losing things, when we're losing species or losing key habitat, or things are changing. We don't even know it. And, and we don't appreciate, the loss.
Right. Yeah. I'm always amazed when I talk to people like you and read the stuff that you've written, how much I have to learn. And I always think I like this stuff. I care about it, and I read about it actively, and I still don't feel like I know enough. So conversations like this are, I think, really important.
Well,
you're
the key to the future. I mean, you're part of my optimism.
Well, thank you for that.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. I appreciate it. And I think we are just about out of time, but this has been fascinating. I've learned more, and I'm sure our listeners have learned a lot more as well about oaks and their decline and what we're doing about it. So I just wanted to say thank you so much for coming on, and I hope we can talk to you again soon.
I appreciate it, Colin. And I just want to say I welcome anybody contacting me, and I can be a point person to, for more information on oak ecology and management. So don't be shy about reaching out to me.
That's Dr. Day. Dey. All right. Thanks, Dr. Day.
Thanks, Colin.